It's a fascinating time. I have been asked this question so many times, and if I'm honest, as a nerd for history, I wish I could be there right now, an upfront, front row seat to these proceedings. Why? Well, the politics are interesting and the players are cool, but what's absolutely fascinating is this test of the United States Constitution. There are details regarding procedure, where people sit, where they walk, how they say this, how they say that are absolutely fascinating. And to folks who really like the minutia of history and the minutia of precedent and process and procedure, it's a treat. And so while I am very aware that this is a difficult time for the nation, there are also great opportunities to learn from our nation.
So what's happening today on the floor of the United States Senate is different from most days. Most days that chamber is mostly empty most of the time. Even when you see on one of the news organizations a senator giving a speech on the floor, usually they're speaking to nobody except maybe the interns and pages who have to be there. But today it's a very crowded floor of the Senate. You have the House managers and you have the president's defense team are on the floor, and you have all of the United States senators sitting at their desks being part of this process. So to have everyone there, I actually think they should do that every day. Lock them in there and force them to debate, to compromise, to vote, and do that over and over again. But today is a different day. So impeachment is a little tricky. The president has been impeached. There are 2 articles of impeachment. That's what was voted on in the House last month, about 30 days ago.
And what we're facing now is an impeached president. Speaker Pelosi, along with her cohort, introduced articles of impeachment, 2 of them, as a matter of fact, obstruction of Congress and abuse of power. And those articles have been debated and voted on. The House has passed them and sent them over to the Senate.
And the Senate's job is to really review that and then to cast a vote as to whether or not they should convict the president and remove him from office. And that has to be done by 67 senators. So it's not just simple majority, 51. You have to get 67 members of that Senate to vote to convict the president. Otherwise, that will go into the history books as someone who was impeached in the House, not convicted in the Senate, and the president would stay in office.
The president is accused of 2 things specifically. Number 1, abuse of power. That is when an individual, for either personal or political gain, a president, will use the power of his office to improve himself personally or politically. That's out of bounds. That shouldn't happen. And it is for that reason that the Democrats, under the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, have introduced the first article of impeachment. The second is interesting. He's accused of obstructing Congress. And the grounds for that accusation, again leveled by the Democrats in the House, is that he made it very difficult for them during their investigative process to speak to members of the executive branch. It was the instruction from the White House that those who were called to testify before the House shouldn't do so. And so the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, along with the various Democrat chairmen of the committees, have interpreted that as obstruction of Congress.
Yeah, really important. A lot of us try to wrap our heads around what an impeachment trial is. It's very different from a regular trial like we would see in a courtroom or what we often see on television these days. It's a little different. The senators themselves are both the jury and the judge in this particular case, and so their job is to carry out justice. That's the oath that they have taken.
And the fascinating part is it's one of the only times in history where you will see members of the House speaking on the floor of the Senate. And there are prosecutors and there are defense members, defense team put together in defense of the president, obviously.
And so they will hear the evidence, but what they're working on is what the House has already done.
So Speaker Pelosi assembled a team of managers. The job of those managers is to literally walk across the Capitol building and take up their position on the floor of the United States Senate and prosecute the case against the president. Try to make the case to the senators who will ultimately vote as to whether or not the president is deserving of his office. If they make the case successfully, if those Democrat managers convince the senators that in fact the president has sufficiently abused his power and obstructed Congress, they'll cast a vote, and if a sufficient number vote in a certain way, the president's out of office. Now, politics in this circumstance say that probably won't be the case.
So this is not a big fishing expedition. This isn't a chance to have all kinds of different witnesses and bombshell statements and so on. They're really supposed to take the work that the House did and then actually review that, drill down on it, and then vote on it.
Okay, if a president is convicted by the Senate, then he's out of office. And line of succession means that the vice president would then assume the position. During normal operations in the Senate, it is the vice president who presides over the Senate. So if you look at that, there's a conflict there. If I'm a nefarious vice president and I am sitting in the chair presiding over the proceedings which would potentially oust the president, I could stand to gain very much there. Now, the founders, they understood that. They understood that these impeachment proceedings could make their way to that circumstance playing out, and it is for that reason that we have the rule which makes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court the presiding officer over these proceedings. And it's for that reason that John Roberts is sitting in the chair of the President of the Senate.
While he does get the best seat in the House as he presides, he has very little power.
Now, interesting thing about John Roberts, his day-to-day duties, he has a day job, as you know. He's the Chief Justice. And today, the first day of these Senate proceedings, the Senate trial against the president, he started the day hearing 2 hours of oral arguments in the Supreme Court. And there were literally minutes in between the end of those oral arguments and the commencement of the proceedings in the Senate. It was fascinating. A car had to pick him up, race across the street, and he was seated in the same robe he was wearing across the street at the Supreme Court as he gavelled in the proceedings in the Senate trial.
It looks like the timing of this will be over the next several days. You'll have about 24 hours of testimony where the House managers and the president's defense team will lay out the case. Once that's been done, again, 24 hours over 3 days, then there will be a series of votes in terms of will they accept additional information, more testimony, more witnesses to be subpoenaed. That will all be decided probably early on next week. There's really no limits in terms of what the president can or can't do while they're impeached. You can remember back to the Bill Clinton impeachment.
William Jefferson Clinton was impeached, and yet he remained in office. Donald Trump has been impeached, and as Speaker Pelosi repeats over and over, he will forever be an impeached president. But that does not mean that you are removed from office. There is a very important second part, which is playing out right now in the news, and that is the trial in the Senate. It is up to the Senate only. They are the only body empowered to remove a president from office. The House can impeach and pass articles of impeachment, and it is up to the Senate as to whether or not that president will be removed from office. At no time in history has the Senate removed a president from office. In 1868, when it was Andrew Johnson facing impeachment, the House passed the articles, and the Senate ultimately vindicated the president and acquitted him of those charges. Same played out in the case of William Jefferson Clinton, Bill Clinton, and it is likely, the politics indicate that that will be the case for President Donald Trump. There's not a ton of precedent. It's relatively vague. Much of the rules that govern these proceedings have been invented by us, as well members of the Senate and the House. We've really had to feel our way around. What is clear in the Constitution is that there is a very clear check on abuse and mismanagement of the executive office by the president, and this is that check.
The rules for the impeachment process will be determined by the senators themselves. They will be put forward and then they will be voted on. The numbers that you should be watching this week are pretty simple, 53 to 47. You have 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. The vote on most of the rules, most of the things that will dictate how this trial is carried out will be decided by that 53 to 47 vote.
The Democrats are interpreting the actions of the president in one way, constituting high crimes and misdemeanors, and it is the conservatively minded Republican folks that are saying, actually, no, he was merely operating within the bounds and within the power afforded him by the Constitution. It's an interpretation of vagary that has led us to today. That depends on the Senate. So, the Senate, when this is all said and done, will take 1 or 2 votes. If the president is convicted by the Senate, he is removed from office. If that vote is cast sufficient to remove him from office, then a second vote is cast, and it is to answer that very question. The Senate will decide whether or not the president is eligible or ineligible for holding future elected office. Now, the highest likelihood is that won't be tested in this case. The politics seem to indicate that the president will be acquitted and that he will remain in office. But if the Senate were to decide to remove him, they would then have a second decision to make, which would be whether or not he was qualified or disqualified to hold future office.
I think the important takeaways for us as a country and as individuals is to always pull back from that. And while we can be very pessimistic about our politics, I'm still more bullish about the future of the country than I've ever been. And the reason for that is because our politicians rarely lead this country. It's community, it's culture that lead, and the politicians follow. And so what we do day to day, especially in places like Utah, where we have a great economy that's booming, we have institutions of civil society with faith groups and churches and volunteer organizations, businesses that give back to the community. That's what has always made this country, and we need to remember that. Again, community leads, politicians usually follow. That's our history. And even though these are heavy days, we don't need to wring our hands. The future looks really good for the country, and I think it will continue that way.
I want people to know, as they watch the proceedings carry out in the Senate and they look back at the impeachment proceedings in the House, that while there is reason to believe that this indicates great division in our country, there's also reason to be encouraged that the founders of this nation put in place a system to protect the Constitution. There are checks on the abuse of power. There are checks on what could possibly challenge the Constitution. And this is that challenge in the extreme. And thus far, the Constitution, she's holding up all right. And I believe that over the next few weeks, this impeachment trial in the Senate will, who knows the outcome, but it will come to an end, and the United States Constitution will continue to endure. So too will our nation, so too will our freedoms, and that's reason to be encouraged.